Welcome to the Social Hour. My name is Nicole York. This is the first interview in the series with amazing creatives, and today I am interviewing underwater portrait photographer based in LA, Brett Stanley. Welcome.
Hey there.
So I'm super glad that we're doing this, Brett, because ever since I first met you in Vegas and found out what you do and the fact that you like the whole idea of building underwater sets as well is so cool to me, because you see underwater photographers and a lot of the times they almost, if they're not shooting like in the ocean or in a place where the environment really plays into it, it almost looks like they're in another world. You know, it doesn't always look like it's like underwater.
Yeah.
And so like first, okay, I'm super excited. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. So before we get into the cool set building and stuff, what kind of got you into photography in the first place?
Photography for me was, I don't know, like it was something that started not when I was a kid, but when I was maybe in my late teens, I think. And I was in Australia where I grew up and playing in a lot of bands and music and stuff. And I was around a lot of really creative people, and I can't draw at all. I can barely write. So my brother was actually more into photography than I was because he was a surfer. So he ended up buying a camera and some really long lenses to shoot surfers down our local beach.
Sure.
And I somehow inherited his camera, which was which was this like Russian Zenit camera. It was like made out of solid steel. And I started playing with that, and it was film. So it was, you had to wait days to see if you took any good shots. And generally I didn't. I started to kind of play around with lenses and stuff, and started taking pictures that I'd seen in magazines or in books and stuff. And it started to kind of click for me, but not something that happened overnight. So over the next few years, I kind of plugged away at photography, and I started traveling, and then took a camera away with me, and I bought a nifty 50, the Canon 1.8, the little plastic thing, which is my most favorite lens ever. And it was the lens that kind of went, whoa, okay, these look like photos that someone else's, these look professional because everything's out of focus,
that blur, that desirable blur, huh?
Yeah. And that when I got that bokeh, I was like, oh, that's it's happening for me. And so I was traveling a lot, and I did a lot of kind of travel photography and didn't really do much with it. But I started to take pictures of my friends and my friends' kids and my nieces and nephews and stuff. And my sister-in-law said, oh, I would totally pay you to take pictures of my kids. And I was like, hang on. Oh, let's try that. Let's try being paid for this, So I quit my job as an IT guy and started out on my own, and I built a studio and plugged away at that for a while, and then I got rid of the studio because it wasn't making any money. And this was in New Zealand, so I'd moved to New Zealand from Australia.
Okay.
And kind of just tried to build up the commercial side of stuff from there. So that's the kind of path to the commercial side of the photography. So I was doing some advertising stuff and portrait stuff, and in New Zealand the market is really small.
Sure.
There's like 4 million people in the entire country.
Right.
So, and I live in LA, which has 10 million just in LA, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And just that's how I kind of got into photography, was just through that.
Yeah. So just kind of a long, slow process, right? Of like, and when you first started playing with the camera and, getting shots and stuff, was there something at that point, was it just an interesting kind of thing, or was there something driving you? Was there like, I know at least for me, I have a compulsion to make things, even if I don't have a camera. I'm either like painting something or drawing something or whatever. How did that kind of develop for you?
It was, I don't know. I think I'm the slow burn, I think, sums me up, I think, because I always was a visual person. I always created stuff. I was always very handy, I guess. You know, when I was a kid,
Sure.
for birthdays and stuff, instead of like action figures, I'd get cardboard boxes and glue and tape and build robots and cubby houses
Yeah.
and that sort of stuff. And I think that was my visual way of creating something, you know. So I would, whatever was in my head, I would get that out by building it. And I think visually, my only outlet was photography, because it didn't require any of my non-existent skills.
Sure.
And so as I got more into it and got older, I got slowly better and better at being able to bring the images in my head out into the real world through the camera.
Right.
And I think that even when I was doing the commercial work in New Zealand, it was still a struggle for me. I was trying to be someone else. I was seeing the work that other people were creating, and I was trying to emulate them and never getting there, never making it as good as what they did. So I was, you know, I never felt great about it, but I could see the potential in there. I could see that I was on the right path. And it wasn't until I started playing underwater where it all clicked for me. And I feel that underwater is something that I am actually really good at.
Yeah.
I don't know
I
why
would
that
say
is,
so.
But yeah, thank you. Yeah. But it's just something that it all just seemed to come together. It was like all those paths were leading to this point of
right.
being underwater to use those skills, whereas they don't work as great on land.
Gotcha. I find that really interesting. It seems to be, from photographers that I've talked to, a big part of the story of like that progression of kind of finding your voice and finding out what you do, where you spend that time kind of mimicking other people because you see their success and you go, oh, that's what you're supposed to do if you want to be successful. So you do what they do. And then there's that kind of feeling of like unfulfillment, and when you're always comparing your work to theirs and it never matches up. And it's kind of depressing, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And because you've got that comparison, and whether you know how they got to that image and their struggles to get to it, and for them that image might not have been, you know, that might have been their image that they emulated someone else. You never know,
right,
through what you're seeing from that one image what the path was to get there.
Totally.
All you're seeing is what you're projecting onto that image.
Right. Yeah, all your assumptions based on what you think and what you've seen and how you understand success, or all of that stuff. Yeah. So where was it that water started to come into play? So you're, doing commercial and advertising stuff. And then how did you first get introduced to underwater photography?
So I've been into the water since I was a kid. I grew up as a water baby. I was in our swimming pool every day as much as I could in the summer.
Sure.
And as soon as I was allowed to get my diver's license, I think at like 14 or 16, I went and did that. And then, and that was pre-photography. So I was, diving and all that sort of stuff. And then I got into photography. And when you're a diver, the progression is to take your camera underwater and take pictures of fish and coral and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
So I started there, but it was ultimately unfulfilling to me because I'm not someone who enjoys taking pictures of little fish, and I could never see it didn't really scratch an itch for me.
Right.
And so I had an underwater camera that I bought for diving and never really used it. I would go on some trips and I took some awesome photos of humpback whales in Tonga, like 12 years ago. But that was probably the best that I ever did wildlife wise.
Sure.
But from shooting that, I realized that I like shooting larger things in the water, like larger mammals in the water. So, so those sorts of things. So I realized that, okay, let's not look at fish anymore. Let's forget about that. But then trying to shoot whales and big animals around the world is really hard because you've got to travel a lot and be in the right spot.
This is true.
And I get highly seasick, so I'm not going to be out on boats for so long, So the next step for me was, in the commercial world I was in, it was so small that I was looking for something that was going to set me apart. Something that was different. And a lot of my dreams and a lot of my fantasy worlds are underwater, basically. So movies like The Abyss and The Big Blue, things like that were I wanted to be in those worlds. I wanted to create those worlds if I could. And so I took my little point and shoot waterproof camera to my local swimming pool, and there was a group of photographers in New Zealand doing I guess like a traveling dress kind of photo
right.
shoot. They'd send it to the next person, they'd take a photo,
Sure.
and then that sort of thing. And it was a pair of dungarees, like overalls. And I took my friend Jared into our local public swimming pool, and I took a picture of him in those dungarees underwater, and it turned out, and I was like, oh, okay.
Proof of concept, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so then that basically just went from there, and I just started having more and more motivation and more kind of ideas of where I could take that underwater stuff.
Right. And then, so as you kind of got into that world, were there certain things that like inspired you or motivated you? Where were you getting kind of your ideas and your inspiration?
So a lot of what I wanted to do was taking my normal above water work and taking that underwater to see if I could replicate it. Excuse me. Because I'd seen the underwater work that I was seeing was kind of, I think you mentioned earlier, where it seems like people are just in a void, like they're just
right, yeah, or space, or
or it looks like they're a very well lit thing against a very dark background.
Sure.
And what that comes from is when you're a dive underwater photographer, you have to have your whole studio set up on your camera because you're moving through the water with it. And so what happens is you end up having two big strobes. As I take the microphone out. Two big strobes.
Don't damage your equipment on my show.
Two big strobes on either side. And so you basically got, that's as much as lighting as you have. You can't get them any further away. And so you get this very flat, well-lit look, which is perfect for shooting animals and fish and stuff underwater, but not great for shooting fashion or, advertising stuff. And I have a love of cinematic lighting. I love playing with gels. I love kind of getting the lights off in weird places. I love lighting. I just love lighting, really.
Sure.
And so I wanted to take that idea underwater, which meant I had to start taking my lights off my housing and putting them in other places.
Right.
And as I said earlier, I love to kind of build things and kind of construct things. So for me, it was the challenge of building my own equipment to do this because I didn't want to spend any money because underwater gear is really expensive.
Yeah.
And I had a bunch of Canon EX580 flashes. Just the usual on-camera flash. And because I was in the whole strobist kind of world, I had like 5 of those things. And I decided to see if I could take them underwater. So I built little housings for them and ended up taking them under the water with me to place around the swimming pool or whatever to try and get different lighting. So most of my ideas come from either cinema and trying to replicate lighting or from the challenge of having to build something to do it.
Gotcha. And so were you always a movie lover? Like, was that always a thing that kind of inspired you and you carrying that forward? Or was that something you turned to as like, this isn't looking the way I want it to, where can I find inspiration to?
I think I've always been a movie lover. I've always read, I'm very visual. So it's those kind of books and movies that got me through kind of life. And it was, I think I always enjoyed lighting, but it wasn't until I started trying to build my own lighting scenarios that I realized why I liked certain scenes from certain movies and why things worked, with the different kind of color theories and all that sort of stuff started to make sense to me. And then I could pull from those and go back through all the films that I'd seen and kind of pick scenes and go, oh, the lighting on that is incredible.
Right.
How do I replicate that?
It's so interesting how much more you appreciate the psychology of it when you actually learn how it's done and why it's done. It makes worlds of difference when you're watching a movie. It's like you are enjoying it on just a immediate, visceral level, and then also on an intellectual level when you're like, oh, look at the character lighting here, and like how they built this, and it's just so it is inspiring, isn't it?
Oh, totally. And I think that is something that I used to play in bands a lot, and I used to play bass. And before I started playing bass, I would listen to a song as a whole. But then when I started
Right.
playing bass, I couldn't listen to that song anymore. I was just listening to the bass line of that song. And it
Right.
almost started to kind of ruin music for me because I was so fixated on that one thing. But then I got a little older and I started to hear it all as one thing again, but could appreciate that bass line
Right.
and what
Right.
went
Right.
into it. And so now I watch films and I appreciate the movie as a whole. I appreciate the emotional response to that lighting, but then I also geek out on the technical aspects of how they built that kind of scene. It just kind of,
Totally.
yeah, there's too much going on.
Yeah, it's a lot. So as you first start by building these housings, do you still build your own kind of gear for underwater, or what are you using now to light scenes underwater?
Yeah, I do. So what I started doing was, so my business philosophy is that if it's not making you money, you can't spend money on it unless you
Fair.
are guaranteed that it's going to make you money. So
Right.
my whole thing with underwater was, is this a test? Is this a phase? Is this going to go somewhere? Is this going to start paying my rent? And
Right.
so I didn't invest any money, but I invested a lot of time building things for it. But then once I realized it had legs and I was getting repeat bookings and I was getting work from it, then I started to invest some money into the gear. So I started
Gotcha.
with a Ewa marine housing for my camera, which is basically a glorified Ziploc bag,
Right.
which you put your camera in. And it's scary as hell because there's not much between your camera and the water.
Because there goes your camera into the water, right?
Yeah. And I had one leak after a couple of years.
No.
I mean, it was amazing because it folded down to this tiny little tube and I could travel a lot with it and it was totally fine. But it got a tiny little pinhole in it. I nearly lost my Canon Mark III because it leaked. And so after
Oh
that, I
gosh.
was like, okay, I think I'm gonna have to spend some money on a proper housing. So I
Yeah.
upgraded to a full aluminum, solid housing, which meant, I had this thing about this big now that the camera went inside of, and
Yeah.
and then so that was good. And the equipment that I built originally, was starting to fail. So I started, as I got more work, I spent more money on getting better equipment. So then I,
Sure.
got lights and lighting that are meant to do what I was making them do.
Sure. Sure.
Today I still build stuff because I'm trying to do things that the underwater industry isn't really catering for.
Ah.
So in the retail underwater camera industry, they're mainly focused on wildlife and sports photographers.
Okay. Sure.
And what I'm doing is basically being a studio portrait photographer, but underwater.
Yeah.
So
What I would love to hear about that is so do you approach lighting the same way, or are there any rules or things that change underwater that force you to alter the way that you would light underwater as opposed to above ground?
yes, oh, totally, yeah. The physics of being underwater are totally different to the physics being above water. Underwater light will be absorbed by the water.
Okay.
So the reason that water looks blue is not because it's blue. It looks
Mm-hmm.
blue because it absorbs all the other light colors first.
Right.
So in the light spectrum, you have, you go from your warms to your colds, you go from your reds to your blues. And the red warm side of the spectrum is really weak. It's not a very strong wavelength.
Sure.
And so it can't penetrate the water very well. So at the surface of the water, if you put your hand under, your hand probably looks normal. But the deeper you put your
Mm-hmm.
hand, the more bluer and the more greener it goes because those red lights aren't making it down to there.
Right.
So shooting underwater, you need to take that into account because it's going to change all the color values of what you're doing. The more you can take light down with you, which is why if you've ever seen a nature documentary or someone's photograph and it looks like whatever it is, the fish is kind of nice and warm, but the rest of it's really blue, is because they've got a light right here.
Right.
And it's, giving out that warm light.
Right.
So for me, taking the lights and stuff under the water, I have to take into account how far the subject is away from my lights to be able to get the right kind of colors.
Gotcha.
The other thing,
so does that put constraints on how big of a set you can build?
It does, to a point. Yeah. I mean, the bigger the set, the bigger the distance from your light to the subject, the brighter the light has to be to get to the subject.
Right.
And it's really kind of mind bending when you're under there trying to work out what of those things needs to change to give you the look that you're after. If you're in a dry studio, you kind of think, okay, well, my light is here, my subject's here, and they look pretty good, with this key light. If I do a rim light, it needs to be this kind of value to be able to get, the look I'm after. You don't have to worry about the distance so much because it's just going through the air. But underwater, it's as it goes through the water, it's also losing intensity as well as color.
Right.
So you really have to think about those things. And the bigger the set, the more light you need.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you ever so I know refraction happens a lot in water. Does that ever alter how you have to do light placement? Are there any weird physics with that or is it still kind of pseudo the same?
So refraction only happens at the
surface, right?
Yeah. So all the lights that are under the water will end up where you're pointing them. But I tend to shoot with dry lights on the surface as well. And so what happens there is that if you're looking through the water and you think you've aimed it at the thing, you probably haven't, because as the light comes through, it bends to hit the subject. So that's always kind of weird because you're often missing your mark if you're trying to use like a strobe or a snoot or a spot or something.
Right.
And the other thing is that the water is reflective. So a lot of your water of your light is actually going to bounce off.
Sure.
So it's going to dissipate to start with. And then the other thing is the refraction through the ripples. So as the water kind of moves, it changes the angle of that refraction, which is why when you look at the bottom of a pool or in the ocean, you have those refracted kind of things. And if you don't want that in your shot, it's really hard to get rid of it unless the water is like dead still.
Right. Which is difficult with a bunch of people moving around inside of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so there's all these things that you kind of learn just through experience from going, why is this not working? What have I done wrong?
Right.
To get this to happen. So the other thing actually with refraction, and I love this effect, is that under the water, if you look directly up, you'll see straight through, you'll see the sky.
Right.
But if you're less than 45 degrees from the surface, let's say if you look at it on an angle, it actually turns into a mirror. So it actually bounces back down again. So as you get someone close to that surface, they're actually being reflected in this mirror. So it is like that solid void kind of thing where you're in this, in this different world.
Right.
But what that means is that if you have a light on the side that is pointing at your subject, if it happens to hit the surface as well, it bounces back down again. And what that does is that if the water's moving, you can get these awesome little refractions happening. And sometimes and this is not something I plan, but sometimes you can get a shot where someone's really nicely lit from the side, but then they have like a streak of light that just goes across their eyes.
That's cool.
And it's like someone's in there with barn doors, kind of hitting their eyes, but it's just purely accidental. And then I love that sort of thing about the underwater, that chaotic, anything can happen sort of thing.
Sure. And I like those little unexpected blessings that just come about by, like you said, you don't always plan for that to happen, and then it does. And it's like, oh, that's exciting.
Totally. Yeah. And that's what drives me with this is finding those little things of, oh, I didn't even know that was going to happen, or I didn't even know that was a thing. So Yeah.
Sure. And then, so you start getting into underwater photography, and then how did set building, like what made that become a thing? And then once you start doing it, do those have a life? Like I have to imagine, I mean, they can't stay down there forever. So like, are you trying to get like as much use out of them as possible? Kind of how do you maintain that and make that work?
Yeah, so the sets for me, I think, were pretty early on something that I wanted to do, because as I, there's all these movies that I love, and all these underwater scenes, like I said, like The Abyss, all these kind of
Mm-hmm.
rooms that they have. And I remember I don't know if you've seen a movie called The Big Blue, came out in the 80s.
Yeah.
And it's about free diving. But there's
Right.
this one scene where one of the characters he's obsessed with the water. He doesn't want to come back up every time
Mm-hmm.
he is in there. And he's lying on his bed in the hotel room, and the water starts to come through the ceiling and starts to come down towards him. So the room's filling up upside down.
Right.
And that's always been in my brain, that I've wanted to do something like that. I've wanted to build a room underwater and somehow fill it up, or play with that kind of connection, or that transition between air and water.
Right.
And I couldn't do it. So most of my career as an underwater photographer, I didn't own my own swimming pool. So building
Sure.
sets either required lots of money and renting a pool, or a tank for a few days to build something.
Right.
Which means that you can't kind of test stuff. You can't do research, what's going to work, what's not going to work. If you're renting a pool for 2 days, knowing you've got to shoot with a set, and if it doesn't work, you've kind of blown your budget.
Right.
So a couple of years ago, we ended up buying a house in Los Angeles, and it had a big backyard, and I built a swimming pool, and I built it with building sets in mind. So it's built with a nice flat bottom. It's deep enough to be able to fit a room in. And as soon as that was built, I started building sets.
Yeah. So one of those, like, it is now time at last.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah. I would sit, when it was just filling up full of water, I would sit on the edge of that going, what am I going to build first? What of all the things I've been thinking about is going to be the first thing? So, and what happened was that I had a musician contact me, or their label contacted me, wanting to shoot some artwork for their album cover.
Is this the 80s bedroom?
Yes.
I love that. The shot. I love those. Love those. Love those. Okay, I'm sorry. Continue.
No, that's fine. So that's how I feel about it. I'm still excited about that shoot. And it was just serendipity, because they had, well, the artist Wiseblood, Natalie, she had done some research. I think she'd found my images, and the label contacted me and said, we want to shoot this thing. Have you ever shot a room underwater before? And I said, I haven't shot a room, but I've shot sets underwater before.
Sure.
I've done little things, but nothing big. And they were like, okay, well, but this is what we want to do. And we have a set designer, all that sort of stuff. So all you need to do is just basically shoot it. I was like, okay, cool. So they turned up on the day. They had their set designer there. And he'd never done anything underwater before. So what he was trying to build wasn't actually going to work, because underwater, there's pressure from the water, there's currents, there's all sorts of kind of factors that make things really hard. And what he was building was going to just not work. It was going to look terrible.
Sure.
So we ended up...
I'm picturing like pillows floating away.
Yeah. Well, it was more like,
there goes the dresser.
Yeah. I mean, we had those sorts of issues anyway, because with like furniture, it's kind of interesting. But the way he was building it was the walls weren't going to be fixed to anything. They were basically hanging from a truss above, and so it was all just going to basically... It's like building a room out of sheets on your clothesline. Right. Yeah. It's never going to sit still. It's never going to line up. And so we ended up taking an extra 4 days. And I'd spent a lot of time thinking about how I would build a set in the years leading up to this. And so I said, look, I can build a set, but it's going to take a few days. but it's going to be way better in the end than what we were trying to do in one day.
Right.
And so me and my team of Ryan and Jenny ended up spending 3 days building this set. And it was basically an 8x10 room, 8 foot tall, that we ended up building on land and staging all the furniture and stuff in it to get everything in the right spot. And then we broke it all down and then built it back again in the pool.
Right.
So we're on scuba, we're taking furniture and putting it in. One of the weirdest things I've ever had to do was make a bed underwater.
I can imagine that not being the most ideal, like, people can't make beds. I don't make my bed in my real life, but like people can't make beds. They can't like stretch sheets. They can't even do that in regular dry land. So I can imagine that being really weird underwater.
It was so strange because when you're underwater, it's really quiet. So it's really silent. And then me and Ryan are basically on the edge of this, kind of little, 80s brass and metal bed, trying to put a fitted sheet in together and kind of looking at each other across the bed. And it was like this kind of semi-romantic moment. Yeah, exactly. And then we are pulling the duvet open and folding it back and all this sort of stuff. So
that's so funny.
Yeah. And to be honest, that was one of the things that those little moments make my life worthwhile, because they're the ones that are just like, this just doesn't happen to everyone,
Right. Do you think that underwater photographers have to be maybe like a special breed of person, or do you think it's something anybody can do with kind of the right like mindset, training over time, experience, etc.?
I think you can learn the skills, but I think the best underwater photographers that I know are the ones that are underwater people first and then a photographer second.
That makes sense.
So someone like Cheryl Walsh, she is an underwater photographer because she just wants to be somewhere quiet. And she wants to be where she doesn't need to direct anyone or talk to them so much, so that's her kind of way of doing it. Whereas other friends of mine who are underwater photographers, they take photos because they want to be under the water. And that's why I do it, because I want to be under the water. So if I'm going to be down there, take some photos,
What is it for you about being underwater that is so attractive?
It's a dreamscape. It's the thing that we all dream about. It's the place where you can fly. It's weightless. It's quiet. You're down there with your thoughts. There's no need to talk because you can't. It's a place of magic, things slow down. It's like being in treacle. It's like everything moves so slowly that you have so much more time to think. And everything has to have so much purpose, because if you're going to push from one side of the pool to the other, and if you've ever seen people in space, they kind of can't adjust course once they're in the middle of it. You've got to be kind of exact. And whilst it's a little different underwater, you kind of have to have a plan. And I like that. It's the one place where I feel quiet and I feel calm.
Right.
Most of my life, my brain is like a hummingbird. When I'm underwater, it just slows down.
I love that. Yeah. I feel something similar when I'm rock climbing. You have to be so focused on what you're doing. I'm the same way with like my mind is constantly running. There's always something going. It's really, really difficult to turn it off. And then when you're climbing, you have to be absolutely focused on what you're doing and on your body and on something about the sense of movement and the way you feel your body move and the way that you're focused on just what's coming next and nothing else matters. And I imagine people probably say to you that they can't, like that their claustrophobia, they can like, I couldn't do that because being underwater would be scary or whatever. And then with climbing, people kind of say, I can't imagine like hanging off of my fingertips on a rock so far above the ground, but you're not thinking about that when you're in the middle of it. You're so focused on like being there that those thoughts never have a chance to kind of come in and ruin things.
Well, that's pretty much what's like underwater for me, is that I feel like, so being underwater on scuba for me is good, but if I can go under, and most of the time when I'm shooting, I'm under there without any scuba, But
Right.
holding my breath underwater, I feel, is like a superpower. That's as close to being a superhero as you can get for us. And I feel like for you, like in the rock climbing sense, like doing a free solo would be the same.
It probably would be. I would never do it, but I can only imagine. Yeah. I mean, having, talked to other climbers and seen interviews and stuff, I think there's also, for people who do that, also something of the ultimate mastery of having done a thing, being able to say, I have reached that point of ultimate mastery. How long can you hold your breath?
I am not particularly sure, because
I feel like you need to time this now. So I need to know these things, Brett.
So the times that I have tried to hold my breath and time myself, I don't do it very well, because in my head I'm going, oh, you're timing it. Oh, is it time up? For me, holding my breath underwater, and this is what I teach my clients as well, is you can hold your breath underwater longer if you're not thinking about it. Right. So for me, the longest breath holds I've ever done when I'm shooting. So if I'm shooting like a music video and I'm on the back of the camera and we're doing a scene, and that scene just never stops, like it's just getting better and better. Yeah. Like I will just keep shooting whilst my body is slowly kind of freaking out. But because what's happening in front of me is more interesting than what's happening inside me, I forget about that I'm holding my breath. Right. Whereas if I will consciously try and hold my breath for a long time, I won't do it, because my brain will talk me out of it.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. That's such an interesting thing and such a good philosophy for life, I think, because what you focus on determines so much of your experience, right? And if you are focused on the fact that you're holding your breath and that you can't breathe, then before long, your body is going to start like it's going to basically step in and be like, this cannot happen anymore. But if you're focused on like the experience and the amazing things, then the stuff that kind of happens in the background, I feel like it doesn't have as much power over you. No, and it's interesting for me because I suffer from panic attacks. So for me, my happy place, if someone says, just calm down, go to your happy place, my happy place is under the water. But under the water is where I have panic attacks, because it's claustrophobic, you can die, there's stress. So for me, underwater is this double-edged sword of being the place that I love the most in the world, but also the place that scares me the most. Yeah. Oh, that's a powerful thing. Do you feel like you are conquering that almost when you go into the water? Like every time that's a confrontation of like, can I overcome this thing? Yeah, it is. And I think that is what underwater photography is for me, because I think for a lot of us, photography is a type of therapy. Right. For some reason or for some way, we're using it to get something out or to learn something or to ignore something. It's sure. And for me, the photography is my way of holding back the panic and to remind myself that I'm in this amazing place and I can do this. I've done it before. Like, why should it be different this time? Yeah. Do you mind if I ask, and feel free to not answer this if it feels too personal, but do your panic attacks, is that a result of nature? Some of us just have these things, or can you trace that back to something in your past that is triggering? No, there's nothing really in my past. I feel like it is just a personality trait. Sure. That my brain never stops. I have terrible impulse control. My brain never stops, which means that I can't stop it. Gotcha. But it'll do whatever it wants. And it's that horrible feeling of having your thoughts leap from thing to thing within microseconds of each other. Yeah. And you're like, how did I even get to this point when I was thinking about, I don't know, a donut? And now I'm thinking about dying in a collapsed mine. Like I've never been in a mine. How does this happen? Right. Yeah, mine. I am the same. I'm a worst case scenario, so it doesn't matter what it is. My brain, immediately flips all the way. It can't be like, oh, my knee hurts all of a sudden. I have knee cancer and I'm dying in a hospital and my children have come to say goodbye to me. Like it immediately goes all the way. Yeah. To the end. And it seems like definitely, I have found recognizing that I do it and then kind of forcefully, like, it's hard to explain to people who don't deal with anxiety or panic attacks, the idea of like actually physically wrestling with your own brain, like your brain wrestling with your brain. And that doesn't make any sense practically, but it feels like that's what's happening when you're trying to convince yourself, this is you're jumping to conclusions, you're running away with this, when you're trying to like control your thoughts and recognize that that's what you're doing. And it's sometimes you get it and you're like, nope, we're not going there, stop it. And then it's cool. And then other times there's just it's like a runaway train that you can't.
Oh yeah, totally. It's because it's your brain, or my brain does this, where it wants to test if we're okay with it still. So if I've thought about something scary or something that's kind of stressed me out, and I'll be like, no, we're okay, this is good, fluffy kittens, this is fine. And then your brain's like, let's just check and see if does it still bother you, that thing? And it'll go, it'll go back to the thing, like, yes, it still bothers me, why do you take me back there? I don't want to think about it again. But it just keeps picking at that scab, and it's that. And for me, I think it is definitely that impulse control that I need to work on. I need to meditate. I need to find tools to stop myself from going down.
Do you meditate often?
No. I think the closest I get to meditation is being underwater.
That's underwater. Yeah. And I find there's so many people I've talked to that have found that some physical activity is the thing that helps take them outside of their head, which is so interesting because when you are in those dangerous situations, I mean, being underwater could potentially drown or have a catastrophic failure or something like that. Hanging from a rock face, you could fall or a rock could hit you or whatever. And I have a theory about this, which if anybody is a psychologist, like come at me because I'm super interested. But I have this theory that we have, these natural instincts because anxiety and fear should keep you safe for the most part, because your brain is telling you something is wrong, right? Or that there's a danger somewhere. Right. And yet we live these lives that are so safe relatively that that instinct now has less to actually do for us. And I feel like it's continually trying to activate and be like, okay, are we safe? Like popping up again and again, being like, do we need to run? Something's going to happen, protect you. But there's less for that to actually do now. And so it activates and kicks in to things that don't actually make sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's like an alarm that's going off for nothing.
Yeah. Because
it thinks it's doing the right thing.
Not in physical danger.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which is maybe why putting yourself in a situation that could be physically dangerous, you're able to kind of like exercise some of that anxiety and let it serve its actual purpose so that later on it can be like, okay, we've done our job now.
Yeah, exactly.
You're cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, if there's psychologists out there, I want to know, because I feel like maybe that's a good theory, but that's just my guess. So we have a couple questions coming in. Kelly wants to know, do you plug your nose? Do you have webbed toes?
I plug my nose with this finger sometimes, but not on camera. I don't plug my nose. What I do is I wear a mask, and it's different. A mask is different to goggles because goggles only cover your eyes, right? Whereas a mask will cover your nose as well. And when you're a diver, you need to cover your nose because you need to equalize your ears, and you do that by blowing out air through your nose.
Right.
So I don't plug my nose. I don't have webbed toes, but there are gills under the beard.
Oh, that's what the beard is for.
Yeah. It's like Waterworld. Yeah.
Oh yeah, those little guys right here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing with plugging your nose, and it comes up a lot with my clients, is that a lot of people when they go underwater, if they put their head back, water goes up their nose and into their sinuses, and it can sting. It can feel really uncomfortable, and it'd be
panicky too, right?
Like, yeah, exactly.
Oh no, there's water inside.
Totally. And some people just aren't bothered by it. So it's a really subjective thing where, depending on the person, I have to change how I work with them to stop them from having that kind of panic.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But what I have found is that there is a type of nose plug that goes inside your nose that's made of silicone, and it's clear.
Oh, nice.
And what I found is as soon as you block your nose, a lot of the stress that's involved with fear of water goes away.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So using those makes my job a lot easier.
For sure. Yeah. So this is just, I mean, it's relative, kind of a non sequitur. I just think it's funny. I think you might get a kick out of it. Is when my initial instinct when I'm underwater, even though I can go underwater pretty comfortably, is I go like this and I push my bottom lip up so far that it covers the bottom of my nose.
I do the same thing.
I'm like cover those. It's okay. And then nothing can get in there, even though like, why do you need to do that to your cheeks? You don't, but it pushes your bottom lip up enough. So I feel like that. So it makes sense when you say like to have those, that kind of keep them covered helps you deal with the panic. Yeah. Cause I'm like,
oh, I do. I do the same thing. And I think I did it from when I was a kid, and I'd be in the surf and I'd go under a wave and I'd do that. Yeah. And I'd breathe out through my nose at the same time. Yeah. And I think a lot of people do that. Like they're not sure of they don't know what their face looks like under the water, because all they're doing when they go under is trying to seal every orifice that they've got. But as an underwater photographer, I've got to break them out of those habits, because relaxing your face is the best thing for an underwater photo. Yeah. As soon as you start tensing,
making the faces.
Maybe that sort of stuff. Yeah.
That's got to be, so that must be tricky. Do you take some time before you actively start shooting, just to kind of go like under with them and help them get used to not doing those kinds of things? Yeah. So how long are your shoots in general if you have to kind of do that?
So a minimum shoot time for me is 40 minutes. I mean, an hour. And at least 15 minutes of that is just teaching them and getting them to the right space.
Right.
So I say that, so I'm a photographer, but I'm also basically a psychologist as well, because I'm taking someone and I am giving them tools to be able to be comfortable and relaxed in a place that is not somewhere they particularly want to be. So if I have someone who doesn't like the water or has a fear of water or who even can't swim, and I work with all these people, a lot of what I'm doing is teaching them techniques to breathe properly, techniques to be able to sink properly, techniques to relax their face, all that sort of stuff. The difference between what I do in the pool and what someone does in a portrait studio is that I can't really direct them whilst they're doing it.
Right.
So if you're in a portrait studio, you'd sit them down in the front of the camera and then talk them through how to do the thing. Right. Whereas for me, I've got to sort of front load all that. I've got to give them enough information so that they can even get into the set.
Yeah. And feel comfortable. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what do you ever talk to people, or do they explain why they come to you? Like if somebody comes that's not, because I mean, I guess in my head, I'm imagining clients being like all of these water people who just, they want to see that happening. And clearly that's not the case. So do people have specific reasons for kind of coming to you to want to create this art that deals with water aside from just the aesthetic?
Yeah. I mean, most of my clients are people who, well, I mean, it breaks into a few categories. So I have people who are total water babies and love the water and this is just natural for them. But I also have people at the other end of the spectrum who have a fear of water, but love the photos so much that they want to use that to try and get over their fear.
Right.
I also have people who can't swim, but don't have a fear of water. They just never learned to swim.
Yeah.
And they're interesting because they're not scared of this thing. They just can't move in it. You know, it's like, I'm not scared of crossing the road. I just don't know how to do it. You know?
Right. That's so strange.
Yeah. And it's a little bit different because then you've got to kind of teach them kind of how to walk again. You know, I've got to teach them what to do. And luckily, most of what I do doesn't involve any swimming anyway. So what I have done is just I kind of put them on my back and ferry them out to the set, and then they hold on to the ladder across the set, and then they just got to drop down and then claw their way back to the surface again. So it's kind of easy.
That's so crazy. Do you ever have to work with somebody around who, you know, like not a lifeguard per se, but somebody who can, you know, have oxygen there? Or do you take CP, like, oh, that's our timer for 10 minutes left. I mean, we can go beyond our 10 minutes, but I just want to keep us like, you know, somewhere. But do you have to work with like a safety personnel or anybody to kind of, or is that something that you did yourself to kind of bunch up on that so you could take care of somebody if for some reason something does go wrong?
Yeah. So just for myself, I'm a rescue diver. I'm CPR and oxygen certified.
Right on.
So for me, with one person in the pool with me, I feel confident that I can control that situation.
Right.
I'm usually the closest person to the model anyway. But if there's more than one person in the pool, I'll generally have either lifeguard or a safety diver there with me.
Nice.
And what they do, so say if we're shooting in a set and we've got like 3 or 4 people, then we'll have safety divers for them who'll have oxygen as well. So the biggest fear for me when I build these sets and shoot in them, especially people with big, frou-frou dresses,
right,
is getting stuck on something and not being able to get back up.
Right.
So I have things in place so that we can get air down to them and then sort that situation out rather than
Sure.
Trying to get that situation sorted before we get them to breathe again.
That makes sense.
So a lot of what I do, a lot of my insomnia is spent thinking about all the things that can go wrong and how to fix them.
Welcome back, anxiety brain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And in that case, I mean, although it causes you probably some like internal stress, it does mean that people are so safe working with you, which is that kind of double-edged sword, right?
Yeah. And I think that is one of my virtues is that if it seems even just slightly unsafe, then I won't do it.
Right.
I've had photo shoots that I've called off because it's just not going to be safe.
Yeah.
There's just no way to do it with it being safe.
Sure.
And in saying that, right at the other end of the spectrum, I work with some really good professional underwater performers, and the things that I do with them, because we know and trust each other,
right?
We know each other's skills, are just in phenomenal, just amazing stuff.
Yeah.
Because we can do it. It's
right.
just having the right people.
That's got to be the best like high when you're working with people who are so skilled at being able to be in that environment and perform and all of that. So do you save your kind of portfolio type stuff for those people, or do you find yourself also using client shoots in your portfolio?
To be honest, 90% of my portfolio is client work.
Right on.
And that, I think that is a double-edged sword for me as well, because people see those images and assume that these are underwater performers, that they're
right.
talented, are more talented than or more experienced. And so they rule themselves out from booking a shoot
right.
because they don't think they can do it. Whereas in actual fact, that picture of that someone doing that awesome backflip or back arch or whatever in this big, beautiful dress was scared of water, can't swim, and that was their first time doing it.
Yeah. So do you consider yourself, and this is a question I think I'm going to maybe ask everybody, but one of the things that I've talked to a lot of different photographers about is this idea of being a craftsman or an artist. And some of us are craftsmen and kind of work more like illustratively and documentarially in a documentarian something. And then some of us are really having things that we're trying to explore or specific things that we're trying to say. And I do think people can be both. I feel like I vacillate sometimes between those. Sometimes I just want to make something pretty, and sometimes I'm really wanting to explore an idea. Do you have conceptually like how you see yourself in that kind of regard?
I kind of see myself more as a craftsman, I guess. Like I'm more of a constructor of images.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think of myself as an artist so much. I feel like that implies a certain level of, I don't know, forethought or planning, or I don't know. It just seems too fancy a word for me for whatever reason. But
sure.
What I tend to do is I will create a situation where good things can happen. So I have this theory, I call it chaos theory, because when you go underwater, nothing ever goes to plan.
Sure.
So if you have an image in mind, you're probably going to get close to it. If you actually hit that image, man, that's really lucky. But usually you're going to get something that's around that kind of image.
Right.
And so what I have learned over the years is that I have to be more reactive to the situation.
Gotcha.
And I prep my clients knowing that we're going to get whatever we get.
Sure.
We can try for the thing that they want, but to be open to whatever happens.
That's cool.
Yeah, I guess what I do is, say I build a set, like a Baroque room. I put stuff in it. I light it in a way that wherever I end up or wherever someone else ends up, it's going to be good.
Sure.
So I create situations where good things can happen.
That's a really cool approach, because I am a control freak.
Right.
And I'm like, I usually go in having something very specific in my head, and then I build everything to try to make that thing happen.
Right.
And then of course, while I'm there, I feel free to like change or maneuver if it's possible to, try different things or go, oh, just had a piece of inspiration. But I always know that that one thing is the main thing that I want to do. And then whatever else I get is like icing on the cake. And sometimes it's better than my original plan.
Yeah.
But
so do you class yourself as a craftsman then?
I think most of the time I'm a craftsman.
Yeah.
I think because my idea of what an artist is more of somebody who is trying to explore or communicate a specific idea. And so sometimes I've done a couple series where I feel like that's definitely me as an artist. One of them was women with windows in their chests. So I'd went and got a bunch of doll house windows, and we applied them to the chest, and each window was styled in a different way to represent the window to the soul. So things would be coming out of the window. And sometimes it was a window that was just battered and beaten and kind of shuttered, and then light was spilling out of it. Sometimes it was a window that had like bed sheets tied together and tossed out, like someone had escaped. So it was different ideas, and each person who came to be part of that project was somebody who felt a connection to that particular window for whatever reason. And sometimes that was that they had been really kind of confined as a child and who they were. And then as an adult, they felt like they were finally free to like leave all of that behind and escape those expectations. And sometimes that was somebody who had been abused. And so their window was kind of cobbled together and falling apart, but it was still there. And so each one kind of had some kind of, connection to that model. And in those cases, I felt like art was happening because it was, exploring this kind of idea that was deeper than just making something pretty.
Yeah.
Which most of the time is what I like to do. I want to make pretty things. But I've realized recently, which is the question I kind of would like to end with. I've realized recently through conversations with some friends of mine that my why has a lot to do with, as a child, not always feeling very in control of situations, and fantasy books, movies, those kinds of things always gave me hope that anybody, no matter how small or insignificant, was capable of magic, and that amazing things could happen, and that you could go on this journey and get beat up and broken down, but eventually you would succeed in the end, and that, good things were possible. And so fantasy has always been for me that method, not only of kind of escape and a safe place, is what real things are, but increased tenfold. So if somebody is like a nasty stepmother, then they've become a witch. Or, all of those things. It's heightened reality in a way. And so for me, when I'm creating, I always tend toward the fantastical. And I think that that is why. And so I want to remind people through my work that they're more than what they seem, and that they are capable of more than what they think. And so it's all of this kind of heightened thing. Yeah. So for you, have you explored, do you have a why behind your work that is greater than, just this is where I love to be? Is there something kind of deeper that motivates your work?
I think I didn't for a long time until I found my underwater world. I think the underwater world for me is that fantasy that you're talking about. I think for me, it's that other place where beautiful things happen and always happen. There's always a happy ending. There's always a nice story, I think. And I think that's why I tend towards the fantasy kind of thematics of my work. rather than it being, kind of commercial or advertising, which I feel in my mind is a bit more hard edge. For me, it is taking my client or my model to a place where they can be kind of who they want to be and who
Sure.
they think they might want to be or think that they are. Because when you go under the water, you're there with yourself. And I tell them that I'm not, to forget that I'm here. I'm the audience, but I don't want them to interact with me. I want to see them lost in their own little world. And there's this beautiful sense that happens when someone does really kind of just let go and they click and they just relax into that pose or that character or whatever world that they picture themselves in. You can feel the energy underwater just relax. And just seeing that for me is cathartic and therapeutic. And I think it is for my clients as well. So I think of my photo shoots are an experience first and a photo second.
So you're just kind of able to beautifully document this experience of somebody kind of coming to peace with themselves in an environment that is where it's just them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That is super, super cool. I like that a lot.
Thank you.
So before we get to the end, I know that you are doing some pretty cool stuff lately. I know that you've started a podcast. Tell us about what that's looking like for you, what the purpose is, where people can find that.
Yeah, so before we got locked down, I had the idea to do a podcast because I've been asked to be on podcasts a bit over the last few years, and I always enjoy that experience of just talking to people. And I find that by having a conversation with someone, you learn so much more than just hearing them speak directly. Sure. And I'd sort of seen how easy it could be. I think I thought it was a lot more complicated in my head. And then I think just before the whole quarantine lockdown thing happened, I had started to put this in motion, but it just worked out really well that now that everyone's got all this downtime, I can speak to other underwater photographers, underwater cinematographers, people who work in the field that I'm in, which I find is very kind of underrepresented in a lot of
For sure.
And also selfishly, I get to speak to my idols, my mentors, So to me, it's about me recording a conversation that I have with them and then sharing it with everyone else, because I think I learn something every time I speak to someone, and hearing how they approach different problems makes my problems seem easier to handle, I think. Sure. And so that's called the Underwater Podcast, imaginatively named. And you can see it at theunderwaterpodcast.com.
Nice. And then is there anything else that you're currently working on that people should check out?
Yeah, I've started doing online mentoring as well. So if anyone is in the underwater kind of world and wants to learn from my experiences, or portfolio review or any of that sort of stuff, learn techniques, anything of the stuff that I've talked about today, I'm more than happy to jump on a Zoom call or a Skype and chat with people about it and give them advice on how to get better at what they do.
Awesome. So last question before we wrap this thing up. If you were to give one piece of advice to aspiring underwater photographers, what would you say?
It's a two-parter. One is just learn how to be underwater. If you think of it like being a dry shooter, but if you don't know how to walk, you don't know how to get to where you need to be. So learning how to move underwater, control your own buoyancy, how to hold your own breath. If you can't do it, then you can't teach anyone else to do it. And that's what your clients need. And the other thing is just practice everything, because everyone does everything differently, and things underwater never go as planned.
That sounds very much like, it's the truth on land, so it sounds very much like it's going to be the truth underwater.
Yeah, pretty much.
Right on. Thank you so much, Brett, for coming and chatting with me today. I learned some really cool stuff, and hopefully the viewers did as well. If you want to follow Brett online, check out his website. I'm going to have all of those links in the description below, and make sure that you go show him some love on Instagram as well. and just wherever you can follow him, go check it out, because he's got some really incredible work. So thank you again, good sir.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much. We're going to end the live. So guys, if you still have questions for Brett, now you're going to know where to find him. We'll put all the links so you can go find out how he does all of his cool stuff. And until next time on the Social Hour, we'll see ya.
Bye. Thank you.